"Move aside, beggar." The words cracked across the marble like a whip, and the woman in the grey woolen cloak didn't flinch. She only lowered her eyes, as a servant might, and stepped back into the shadow of a tall pillar where the candlelight could not reach her face. A young noblewoman in pale rose silk swept past her without a second glance, trailing perfume and laughter, her satin slippers whispering against the polished floor. Somewhere above, a string quartet began the opening notes of a pavan. Crystal chandeliers blazed with the light of 1,000 tapers, and the great hall of the royal palace shimmered like a jewel box turned inside out. None of the powdered, jeweled, glittering guests noticed the old woman in grey. None of them, that is, except a small boy in a footman's livery who paused to offer her a cup of warm cider, and was thanked with a smile so gentle it would later make him weep. What happened in that ballroom before midnight would shatter 3 of the most powerful houses in the kingdom, end 2 engagements, send 1 duchess fleeing into exile, and force a king to descend from his own throne in front of every noble in the realm. But before the king rose, before the gasps and the dropped goblets and the screams, the old maid stood quietly by the pillar, watching, remembering, and waiting. Before we step deeper into this story, I want to ask you a small favor. If you love tales of quiet dignity that outshines cruelty, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because we publish stories like this every single week. Leave a comment below telling me which country and what time of day you are listening from, because I love reading where in the world you are joining me. Hit that like button if you believe that kindness, even when it seems small, eventually finds its reward. And later in this story, I want you to comment with 1 word. The word is mother. You will know when. Now, settle in, because tonight's tale is one you will not soon forget. The kingdom of Veladonia, in the years following the long winter wars, was a land of gilded recovery. Towns rebuilt their stone bridges, vineyards bloomed again on the southern slopes, and the great noble houses, having survived by either cunning or cowardice, returned to the business of dressing themselves in silk and pretending nothing had happened. At the heart of it all sat the young King Aurelius IV, barely 26 years of age, only 3 years upon the throne, a sovereign known for 2 things, his calm restraint in council, and the impenetrable silence he kept about his own family. He never spoke of his late father, who had died in the 2nd campaign. He never spoke of his older sister, who had vanished into a convent and never returned. And he never, ever spoke of his mother. Court rumor whispered that the Queen Mother had died in childbirth. Other rumors said she had been banished for some unspeakable scandal. A few of the older servants, those who had served at the palace for 40 years or more, knew the truth, but they had been paid handsomely never to repeat it, and so they did not. The king grew up in austere silence, raised by tutors and grim old generals, and when he came of age and took the crown, he wore it as if it were a stone around his neck. In the western provinces, on a rolling estate called Hollowbrook, lived a woman the world had quite thoroughly forgotten. Her name was Edessa Marenholt, though the few who still spoke to her called her simply Madame Edessa, or more often, the old maid of Hollowbrook. She was perhaps 50 years of age, though the lines around her eyes made her seem older, and her hair, once the colour of dark honey, had gone almost entirely silver. She lived in a small cottage at the edge of the great estate, in a modest set of rooms granted to her by the current lord of Hollowbrook, who was, as it happened, a distant cousin. She kept goats, she tended a herb garden, she read by candlelight. She had never married, never borne children, so far as anyone in the village knew, and she rarely spoke of her past, beyond saying that she had once lived at court, long ago, and had been very glad to leave it. The village children loved her, because she gave them honey cakes and never scolded. The village elders pitied her, because they believed she had no one. And the Lord of Hollowbrook, a vain, pinched-faced man named Tobias Marenholt, tolerated her, because his late father had made him swear an oath to do so, and because she cost him almost nothing. Tobias Marenholt was a man who counted every coin twice and resented each one as it left his hand. His wife, the Lady Cressida Marenholt, was a small, sharp creature, with very white teeth and very black eyes, and she had married him not for love, but for the Hollowbrook name. They had one daughter, the Lady Percival, just turned 19, a girl of striking pale beauty whose only true education had been in the careful art of cruelty disguised as charm. Percival had been told from infancy that she was destined to marry a duke at the very least, and possibly, if luck and her mother's scheming aligned, the king himself. To that end, the entire household revolved around her like a fevered solar system, the maids polishing her shoes by candlelight, the cook preparing only those delicate broths she might condescend to swallow, the tutors stammering through their lessons while she examined her own reflection in the silver letter-opener. And when an invitation arrived from the royal palace itself, an invitation to the great midwinter ball, to be held in honor of the king's 3rd year upon the throne, the household nearly took flight. 3 carriages were ordered, new gowns were stitched. Cressida had pearls sewn into the bodice of her own dress and demanded that her daughter be draped in white silk and silver thread, the colors, she said, of brides and angels and queens. And Edessa, the old maid of the cottage at the edge of the estate, was not, of course, to be told. She was beneath notice, beneath conversation, beneath a place upon the carriage seats. But the invitation, when Tobias unfolded it with trembling fingers in his study, contained a strange and unsettling line at the very bottom. The king, in his royal hand, requested that every adult member of House Marenholt be present at the ball, by name, without exception. The line was underlined twice. Tobias read it 3 times. He read it a 4th. Then he summoned his wife, and together they argued for the better part of an hour over what to do about Edessa, the cousin no one wanted, the embarrassment in grey wool. Cressida wanted to simply leave her behind and blame illness. Tobias, who feared royal displeasure more than he disliked his cousin, finally decided she must come, but only as far as the palace gates, and she must, under no circumstances, enter the ballroom in her usual clothes. She would be given an old grey cloak from the servant's chest and told to wait in the corridor with the attendants, and that, Tobias decided, would satisfy the letter of the king's command without staining the family's reputation. Cressida laughed at the cleverness of it. Percival, when told, did not laugh. She only smiled, slowly, and said, "Make sure she is well hidden. I should not like to see her face on my night." And the matter was settled. On the morning of departure, when Edessa was informed that she would be joining the journey to the capital, she received the news without expression. She bowed her head slightly, said only, "As you wish, cousin," and went to prepare her small bag. She owned no jewels. She owned no silk. She owned 3 dresses, all of grey or dark blue wool, neatly mended, perfectly clean. She folded them carefully. She wrapped a small wooden box, no larger than her palm, in a square of linen and tucked it deep beneath her clothes. She fed her goats 1 last handful of grain. She told the village children she would return within the week, and then she climbed into the rear carriage, the one carrying the trunks and the maids, and sat very still as the horses began to move. The Marenholts, in the lead carriage, did not so much as glance back. They were too busy rehearsing the curtsies and bows that Perceval would perform before the king. They were too busy imagining the rings that would soon glitter upon her fingers. They were too busy, as people so often are, to notice that the quietest passenger in their procession was the only one of them who already knew how the night would end. The journey to the capital took 3 days along the Great Eastern Road, and in those 3 days the Lady Perceval complained of the cold, of the food at the wayside inns, of the rough manners of the country folk, and most especially of the presence of her father's cousin, whom she insisted on referring to, in tones loud enough for Edessa to hear, as the embarrassment. Each evening when they stopped, Cressida arranged for Edessa to take her meal in the stables with the grooms, on the grounds that her presence at the table would spoil the appetite of the more delicate ladies present. Edessa accepted these arrangements without protest. She sat among the grooms, who, after the first night of awkward silence, came to enjoy her company, for she asked them about their horses by name and listened to their answers with the patient attention of someone who genuinely cared. By the second evening they were offering her the best portion of bread. By the third evening, one of them, an old stableman with a white scar across his eyebrow, took off his cap and bowed when she rose to retire. He could not have said why he bowed. He only knew that he had served fine ladies all his life, and that this woman in grey wool had something none of them had ever possessed, a stillness that asked for nothing and gave everything. The capital, when they arrived, was already in fever for the midwinter ball. Banners of royal blue hung from every spire. The fountains in the great plaza ran with mulled wine. Pages in white livery ran through the streets, carrying scrolls and bouquets and trembling messages of love between noble houses. The Marenholt party was lodged in a townhouse Tobias had rented at ruinous expense, 3 stories of rented elegance overlooking the palace gardens, and immediately upon arrival, Cressida summoned the seamstresses and the hairdressers and the perfumers. Perceval was scrubbed, oiled, painted, and laced into her white silk gown with the silver thread, and she stood before the long mirror in the upstairs salon, turning slowly, examining herself from every angle, until she pronounced herself, at last, acceptable. Cressida wept with joy. Tobias counted the cost of the pearls one more time, and did not weep. And Edessa, who had been assigned a small, unheated room at the very top of the house, beside the servants, was visited by a single maid bearing the grey cloak that had been chosen for her, a rough, shapeless thing that smelled faintly of mothballs and old hay. The maid, a girl of perhaps 15, set the cloak down on the narrow bed and lingered, twisting her hands. "Madame," the maid said hesitantly, "they say you are to wait in the corridor outside the ballroom. They say you are not to come inside." Edessa lifted her eyes from the small wooden box in her lap, which she had just unwrapped, and smiled at the girl with such kindness that the maid felt her own eyes sting. "I know, child," Edessa said gently. "Do not trouble yourself on my account. What is your name?" "Enelin, madame." "Enelin. A pretty name. Tell me, Enelin, have you ever seen the inside of the royal ballroom?" The girl shook her head, eyes wide. "Then perhaps tonight you will," Edessa said, almost to herself, and she closed the lid of the wooden box and tucked it once more beneath her pillow. Enelin did not understand what the old woman meant, but something in the way she said it, calm and certain, as a person might say the sun will rise tomorrow, made the girl curtsy and back out of the room with unusual reverence. Downstairs, the Marenholts were already climbing into the lead carriage. The pearls glittered. The silver thread caught the lamplight. And in the third carriage, alone, sat a woman in a grey cloak, with a small wooden box hidden against her ribs, and a quiet, terrible patience in her eyes. The royal palace at midwinter was a vision out of legend. Its great gates stood open to receive the procession of noble carriages, and from the inner courtyard one could see straight through the marble arches into the grand ballroom beyond, where the chandeliers blazed like captured suns, and the floor had been polished to such a mirror sheen that the dancers seemed to glide upon their own reflections. Tables of black walnut had been arranged along 3 walls, groaning beneath silver platters of roasted pheasant, glazed quail, sugared figs, candied violets, marzipan towers shaped like swans, wheels of pale cheese veined with blue, dark wines from the southern vineyards in tall crystal decanters, and a great centerpiece of carved ice in the shape of the royal crest. The air smelled of beeswax and cinnamon and orange peel. 300 of the kingdom's finest had been invited, and 300 had come, every one of them dressed to outshine the others, every one of them watching the great gilded doors at the far end of the hall, beyond which, by tradition, the king himself would soon appear. The Marenholts arrived early, as Cressida had insisted, in order to secure the best vantage. Percival entered first, gliding through the marble arches with her chin lifted at exactly the angle her dance-master had drilled into her. Her white silk gown trailing behind her like a low cloud, her pale hair gathered into a crown of silver braids studded with tiny pearls. A small ripple of attention followed her, and Cressida, observing it, allowed herself a thin smile. Tobias, sweating slightly in his stiff collar, bowed too many times to too many people, and behind them, ushered through a side door by a stern-faced steward, came the woman in grey. The steward, who had been instructed by Tobias to keep the cousin out of sight, led Edessa down a long stone corridor that ran behind the ballroom, where the servants moved with platters and pitchers and folded linens. He pointed her to a wooden bench against the wall. "You are to wait here, madam," he said, not unkindly. "Refreshments will be brought. You are not to enter the hall." Edessa thanked him, sat down on the bench, folded her hands in her lap, and watched the servants pass. She watched, in particular, a small boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years in an oversized footman's coat, struggling to carry a silver tray laden with cups of warm cider. The tray was too large for him, and his arms trembled with the weight. As he passed her bench, his foot caught on the edge of a carpet, and he stumbled, and the tray tipped, and 3 of the cups slid toward the marble floor. Edessa moved with a quickness that startled the boy, catching 2 of the cups in mid-air and steadying the 3rd with her elbow. The cider sloshed but did not spill. The boy gaped up at her, terrified, certain he was about to be struck. Instead, the woman in grey smiled at him and helped him rebalance the tray and tucked one of the cups into his free hand. "Drink this one yourself," she said quietly. "You look cold. The next time, ask a larger boy to share your load. There is no shame in it." The child stared at her with the wide, astonished eyes of someone who has been spoken to, gently, for perhaps the first time in his life. He whispered his thanks. He hurried away, and from a small alcove just beyond the corridor, where a half-open door looked into the ballroom, a tall man in dark robes had been watching the entire exchange. He did not speak. He only turned, very quietly, and walked back into the ballroom, and within minutes he was bending to whisper into the ear of a still taller man in the deep blue uniform of the Royal Household Guard. In the ballroom proper, the trumpets had begun their first ceremonial flourish, and Percival Marenholt was already in her element. She danced first with the young Count of Ardren, then with the Duke of Pelisher's 3rd son, then with a foreign envoy from the southern islands, whose accent she mocked the moment he was out of earshot. Between dances, she held court near the central fountain, surrounded by a half-circle of admirers, fanning herself languidly and dispensing little cruelties as gifts. To the elderly Lady Borovin, who complimented her dress, she replied with a sweet smile, "How kind of you to admire something so far above your own taste." To a shy young woman from the provinces, who curtsied to her in passing, she said, just loud enough to be heard, "Oh, my dear, you should not curtsy so low. People will think you are reaching for a coin you dropped." Her admirers laughed. Cressida, watching from a nearby pillar, glowed. Tobias drank a third cup of wine and tried to engage a marquess in conversation about the price of timber. And out in the corridor behind the hall, Idessa sat very still on her wooden bench, listening to the muffled music through the wall, and noticing, with mild interest, that 2 members of the royal household guard had just taken up position at either end of the passage and were pretending not to watch her. The boy with the cider tray returned. He had been sent again, this time to carry small porcelain cups of spiced chocolate. He hesitated as he passed her bench. "Madame," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the guards. "The steward says the corridor is becoming crowded and asks if you might step into the small antechamber there." He pointed. "It is warmer. There is a fire." Idessa rose. She thanked him. She walked to the antechamber, a small octagonal room hung with tapestries depicting the old hunts of the royal forest, and she found, waiting for her there, a tall woman in the deep green robes of a senior palace attendant, perhaps 50 years old, with grey hair pinned beneath a stiff white coif. The woman took one look at Idessa, and her face went very pale, and her hand flew to her mouth, and she sank, slowly, deliberately, to both knees upon the polished floor. "Your Grace," she whispered, "forgive me. Forgive me. I did not know. We were not told. We were not told you had come." Idessa stepped forward and gently raised the woman to her feet. "Hush, Meredith," she said. "I came quietly because I wished to come quietly. You have nothing to forgive. Tell me, child, is he well?" "My son, tell me he is well." The woman called Meredith, who had served in the royal nursery 30 years before, and now ran the household staff of the palace, pressed her trembling fingers to her lips, and nodded. "He is well, Your Grace. He is well. He is taller than his father. He is calmer than his father. But he is lonely, Madame. He is so very lonely. He has searched for you. He has sent men into every province. He has read every letter that came to court bearing your hand, and he has wept over them in private, though he would die before he wept in public. He does not know you are here. Does he?" Idessa shook her head slowly. "No. I came in the carriages of a cousin who does not know who I am either. I wish to see the court he has built. I wish to see, with my own eyes, the kind of nobility that has gathered around him. And I wish to see, Meredith, whether the lessons I once tried to teach this kingdom about cruelty and kindness had taken root or had withered in my absence." Meredith lowered her eyes. "They have withered, madam. In many houses they have withered." Idessa nodded, as if she had expected exactly this answer. "Then perhaps tonight," she said softly, "we shall plant them again." She asked Meredith for 3 small favors. The first was that the steward should be told to allow her to enter the ballroom, but only after the king himself had taken his place upon the dais, and only by the small servant's door at the side, so that she might enter unannounced and unnoticed. The second was that Meredith should find the small boy who had carried the cider, and the maid Enelin who had brought her the grey cloak, and bring them both quietly to the antechamber, and keep them there safe until she sent for them. The third favour she whispered into Meredith's ear, and Meredith's eyes widened, and then narrowed, and then she nodded grimly and pressed Idessa's hand to her forehead in the old gesture of obedience, and she went swiftly out into the corridor to do as she had been bid. Edessa sat down by the fire. She drew the small wooden box from beneath her cloak. She opened it. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, lay a single ring of heavy gold, set with a great square emerald the size of a robin's egg, engraved on its underside with the royal crest and the date of a coronation more than 30 years past. She did not put the ring upon her finger. She closed the box again and held it in her lap and waited. In the ballroom, the trumpets sounded their second flourish, the longer one, and a hush fell across the hall, and the great gilded doors at the far end swung open, and the King Aurelius IV entered, alone, dressed in a coat of midnight blue trimmed in silver, the slender circlet of state upon his dark hair. He was a tall young man, lean and severe, with the careful eyes of a person who had learned very early that almost no one around him could be trusted. He walked the length of the hall slowly, acknowledging bows with brief nods, and he climbed the 3 shallow steps to the dais and took his place upon the carved oaken chair that served, on such evenings, as his lesser throne. He surveyed the room. He saw what he always saw, 300 faces arranged into masks of devotion, 300 mouths smiling smiles that did not reach the eyes. Among them, near the central fountain, he noticed a young woman in white silk and silver thread, standing in a half-circle of admirers, and he noticed, too, that her mother was already maneuvering her into a position from which she might be summoned to the dais for a presentation. He had seen this maneuver many times. He had grown tired of it before he had ever taken the crown. He raised a single gloved hand, and the music resumed, and the dancing began, and the great clock above the dais ticked steadily toward the 11th hour. Cressida Marenholt didn't waste time. She glided forward through the crowd, towing her daughter behind her with the discreet authority of a tugboat moving an ocean liner, and she presented herself to the chamberlain at the foot of the dais with the precise words she had rehearsed for a month. The Lady Percival, of House Marenholt, of Hollowbrook in the western provinces, begs the honour of paying her respects to His Majesty. The chamberlain, a weary old man who had heard this exact sentence delivered by 20 mothers already that evening, glanced up at the king. Aurelius gave the smallest possible nod. Percival was beckoned forward. She climbed the 3 steps with the floating glide her dance master had drilled into her, sank into a curtsy so deep her white silk pooled around her like spilled cream, and lifted her face to the king with an expression of luminous innocence. "Your Majesty," she breathed. The king regarded her. He said politely, "Lady Percival, you have travelled far. I would travel to the ends of the earth, sire, to stand for one moment in your light." A small flicker, something between weariness and distaste, crossed the king's face, so briefly that no one but the chamberlain noticed. "How charming," the king said. "Rise, please." She rose. She lingered. Cressida, at the foot of the dais, held her breath. And then, just as the king was about to dismiss the girl with the briefest possible courtesy, the small side door at the back of the hall opened, and a woman in a grey woolen cloak stepped quietly inside. No one noticed her at first. She walked along the wall in the shadow of the great pillars, behind the rows of seated dowagers, behind the murmuring clusters of courtiers, and she moved with such unhurried calm that the eye slid past her as one slides past a serving maid. But Merith, standing now at the foot of the dais beside the chamberlain, raised her hand in a small, precise signal, and a captain of the royal guard in the corner of the hall received it, and that captain murmured a single word to a herald, and the herald lifted a slender silver trumpet to his lips, and blew, very softly, 3 notes that had not been heard in the royal palace for 30 years. They were the personal notes of the Queen Mother. Half the court did not recognize them. The other half went very still. The king on his dais sat up straight as if struck by lightning. His face went white, and then very, very calm. He turned his head, slowly, toward the side of the hall from which the notes had come, and his eyes searched the shadows, and they found the woman in the grey cloak who had stopped now beside a marble pillar near the central fountain, no more than 10 paces from where Percival Marenholt was still standing upon the dais in her white silk. Percival, who had heard the strange trumpet notes but did not know what they meant, glanced over her shoulder to see what had distracted the king, and she beheld the figure of her father's cousin standing there in that ridiculous grey cloak, and a flush of pure mortification rose in her cheeks. The embarrassment. The embarrassment had walked into the ballroom. After all the warnings, after all the arrangements, the old maid of Hollowbrook had crept in through some servant's door, and was standing now in full view of the king himself. Percival did not pause to think. She did not pause to consider why the herald had blown those notes, or why every dowager in the front row had risen to her feet, or why the chamberlain had taken 3 rapid steps backward and bowed his head. She moved on instinct, the instinct of 19 years of carefully cultivated cruelty, and she descended the dais in a flurry of white silk and crossed the marble floor toward her cousin with her chin lifted and her eyes blazing. "You," she hissed, low and venomous, when she was close enough that only those nearest could hear. "You wretched, shameful creature! How dare you? How dare you crawl in here in that filthy rag? Get out! Get out before you ruin everything!" And before anyone could stop her, before even Cressida at the foot of the dais could cry out a warning, Percival Marenholt drew back her gloved hand and struck the old woman across the face. The slap rang through the ballroom like a pistol shot. The music stopped. Every conversation in the hall ceased at once, as if a great hand had clapped over 300 mouths. The dancers froze mid-step. A goblet slipped from someone's fingers and shattered on the marble. Cressida Marenholt's mouth fell open in a soundless scream. Tobias, near the wine table, dropped his cup, and the woman in the grey cloak, her cheek already blooming with the bright red imprint of a gloved palm, did not raise her hand. She did not raise her voice. She only turned her face slowly back toward Percival and looked at her. Simply looked at her, with an expression of such terrible quiet sorrow that Percival, even in the white heat of her fury, felt her stomach drop. And then a voice from the dais, low and clear and shaking with something no one in that hall had ever heard from their young king before, cut across the silence like a blade. "Step away from her." Percival turned. The king had risen from his throne. He was descending the 3 steps of the dais. His face was white as bone. His hands were trembling. "Step away from her," he said again, louder now, and the words carried to every corner of the hall. "Step away from her at once." Percival stumbled backward, her white silk slippers sliding on the polished marble. Aurelius IV crossed the floor of his own ballroom in long, deliberate strides, 300 faces turning to follow him, and he did not stop until he stood directly before the woman in the grey cloak. He looked into her face. He saw the red mark on her cheek. He saw the silver in her hair that had not been silver when she had left him. He saw her eyes, which were the same eyes that had bent over his cradle, and the same eyes that had wept on the night she had been forced to flee the court, and the same eyes that had watched him from 100 remembered dreams. And then, the king of Veladonia, before 300 of the highest nobles in his realm, sank slowly to one knee upon the marble floor of his own ballroom, bowed his head, and spoke the word that none of them, not one, had expected ever to hear from his lips. "Mother." He said it again, his voice breaking in the middle of it. "Mother, you came. Now would be the moment. If you have been waiting, comment the word now. Comment it for her. Comment it for him." The room did not breathe. The room could not breathe. Several of the older dowagers in the front row had already sunk into deep court curtsies, recognizing now what the trumpet notes had meant, recognizing now whose face they were looking upon. One by one, like wheat bending before a slow wind, the rest of the court understood, and the great hall filled with the rustling sound of 300 people lowering themselves toward the floor. The chamberlain was on both knees. Myrith was weeping openly into her sleeve. The small boy who had carried the cider tray had been brought to the edge of the hall by Enelin, and the two of them stood clutching each other and staring at the woman in grey with eyes the size of saucers. Percival Marenholt stood alone in the centre of the marble floor in her white silk and silver thread, with her gloved hand still raised in the air, and she understood at last, with a slow, cold horror that climbed her spine vertebra by vertebra, that she had just struck the Queen Mother of Veladonia in the face in front of the king. Edessa, who had not flinched, who had not wept, who had not even raised her hand to her cheek, looked down at her kneeling son. She reached out very gently and placed her palm against the side of his bowed head, the way a mother might touch a sleeping child. "My boy," she said softly, and only the nearest courtiers heard her. "My boy, you have grown into a fine man. Rise. The king of Veladonia kneels to no one, not even to me." But Aurelius did not rise at once. He took her other hand, the one not resting on his hair, and he pressed it to his forehead, and he held it there for a long moment while the entire court watched. When at last he stood, he kept her hand in his, and he turned, and he led her, slowly, with the gravity of a coronation procession, across the marble floor toward the dais. The crowd parted before them. As they passed, every head bowed. Even Cressida Marenholt, who had collapsed into a small heap beside the wine table, lowered her face into her hands. Tobias, ashen, sank into a chair, as if his bones had abandoned him, and Percival, still frozen in the center of the floor with her hand in the air, found that her legs would no longer hold her, and she sat down, very suddenly, in a pool of white silk upon the marble. The king led his mother up the 3 steps of the dais. He did not seat her in the carved oaken chair. He had a second chair brought swiftly by 2 trembling pages, an older chair of dark wood inlaid with mother-of-pearl that had been kept in storage for 30 years, and which Merith had whispered for the moment the Queen Mother stepped into the hall. They placed it beside the king's own, slightly to the right and at exactly the same height, and Aurelius seated his mother in it with his own hands. Then he turned to face the hall, and his face was no longer white but burning, and his voice, when it came, was the voice of a sovereign who has waited a very long time to speak. "Tonight," he said, "you have all witnessed something that this court has been hiding from itself for 30 years. The Queen Mother Edessa Marenholt of Veladonia, my mother, was not dead. She was not in a convent. She was driven from this palace by men who feared her counsel and women who envied her grace after the death of my father, when I was 4 years old. She was driven out under threat to my own life. She lived in exile, in poverty she did not deserve, in silence she did not earn, on the charity of a distant cousin's house. And tonight, in this hall, before 300 witnesses, she was struck across the face by a young woman who called her a filthy creature and ordered her to crawl out before she ruined the evening. He paused. The silence was absolute. I have been told all my life that the highest virtue of a sovereign is restraint. I have practiced that virtue every day of my reign. Tonight I shall practice it once more. I shall not order the woman who struck my mother to be dragged from this hall. I shall not order her family stripped of their lands before the morning bells. I shall do nothing tonight that is not lawful and considered. But hear me, every one of you. Hear me, House Marenholt of Hollowbrook. Hear me, every house in this kingdom that has ever spoken cruelly to one you believed beneath you. Tomorrow at dawn, a royal commission will ride to Hollowbrook. Every ledger of that estate will be opened. Every tenant will be heard. Every coin that was withheld from my mother during her years of exile will be counted and returned, with interest reckoned at the royal rate. The title of Hollowbrook, granted by my grandfather to a Marenholt who has now proven his house unworthy of it, is hereby suspended pending the Commission's report. Lord Tobias Marenholt, Lady Cressida Marenholt, you will surrender your seals to the Chamberlain before you leave this hall tonight. A small choked sound came from the heap of skirts beside the wine table. Cressida had begun to weep, not the delicate weeping she had practiced before, mirrors, but a thick, ugly weeping that shook her shoulders. Tobias did not move at all. He stared at the floor as if he hoped it might open and receive him. The king's eyes moved to Percivella, still seated in her pool of white silk in the centre of the floor, and his voice cooled by another full degree. Lady Percival, you will rise. She tried. Her legs trembled too violently. Enelin, the young maid, was sent to help her, and the irony of that small kindness was not lost on anyone in the hall. Percival stood at last, swaying, her painted face streaked with tears, her silver braids coming undone. Lady Percival, the king continued, you struck the Queen Mother of Veladonia in the face. The penalty prescribed by law for the striking of a member of the royal family is death. I shall not invoke that penalty tonight. My mother would not wish it, and I shall not begin my mother's restoration to this court with an execution. But you will leave this hall now in the company of 2 of my guards. You will be taken to the convent of the Pale Sisters in the northern mountains. You will remain there, in service to the sisters, for a period of no less than 10 years. You will not wear silk. You will not wear pearls. You will scrub floors and tend the sick, and learn, perhaps, what your mother failed to teach you. If at the end of 10 years you have learned it, you may petition this court for permission to return to society. If you have not, you will remain there until you have. Percival made a small, broken sound and tried to speak. The king did not allow it. He raised one hand, and 2 guards in deep blue uniform stepped forward, and they took her gently but firmly by the elbows, and they led her, weeping, out of the hall. She passed close by the pillar where she had stood not an hour before, dispensing cruelty to a shy provincial girl, and the provincial girl, who had remained in the hall, did not smile to see her go. She only lowered her eyes and whispered a small prayer for a soul she did not envy. The doors closed behind Percival Marenholt. They would not open for her again for 10 winters. The chamberlain stepped forward and held out a small velvet cushion, and Tobias rose unsteadily and walked the long walk across the marble, and laid upon it his seal of office, and Cressida was helped up by a servant, and made to do the same, and the 2 of them were escorted, not roughly, but not gently either, out through the same doors. The pearls sewn into Cressida's bodice caught the chandelier light one last time as she passed beneath it, and then she was gone. The king turned back to his mother. She had been watching all of this with that same quiet sorrow, the sorrow of a woman who took no pleasure in any of it, who had hoped, perhaps, even on the journey, that no such reckoning would be necessary. Aurelius knelt again beside her chair, less formally this time, the way a grown son kneels beside his mother in a private room, and he said, low enough that only she could hear, "Forgive me for the years I did not find you. I searched. I swear to you, I searched."